How does a trusted British community doctor manage to murder over 250 of his own patients and just get away with it for decades?
Right. It's staggering when you think about it.
It really is. And the answer isn't a failure of police work because, the police didn't even know there was a crime to investigate. It was a failure of demography.
Yeah, it comes down to this really fundamental blind spot. We assume we know what normal looks like in a community.
Right.
But when we don't actively track the architecture of a population, when we basically fail to properly categorize the baseline of who is dying and why, massive anomalies can just hide in plain sight.
Wow.
A serial killer was able to operate simply by hiding his victims inside the statistical noise of an aging population.
That story from the early 2000s, the case of Dr. Harold Shipman, it just completely shattered my preconceived notions about public health data.
I think it does for a lot of people.
Because usually, when you talk about a medical diagnosis, there is an expectation of precision. It feels like engineering, right? You break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and the problem is just visible. It's binary, broken or not broken.
Exactly, and we found a lot of comfort in that binary. In clinical medicine, the focus is entirely on the individual patient sitting right in front of you.
The numerator, so to speak.
Right, the numerator. One patient, one disease, one intervention.
But then you step into the world of public health and suddenly that x-ray machine is pointing at entire nations.
Yeah.
You aren't looking at one bone anymore. You are looking at the architecture of populations.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks. Just like an architect needs to understand the blueprint, the load-bearing walls, the raw materials to build a stable structure, public health professionals have to understand the size, the structure, and the dynamics of a population.
Because if you don't understand the population, you just cannot design an effective health system. You wouldn't build a massive state-of-the-art pediatric hospital in a town where the average age is 75.
Right. That would be completely useless.
It would. Demography provides the denominator for every single public health equation we use. And honestly, that denominator is arguably more important than the numerator.
So whether you are a medical student, a public health trainee, or a practicing clinician, you simply cannot measure risk or allocate resources without knowing who and how many you are serving.
Exactly. If you don't know the denominator, the numerator is just a floating, meaningless number. It tells you literally nothing about risk.
And that is the core mission of this deep dive. We are functioning as a companion guide to Chapter 6.3 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
Highly recommend reading it alongside this discussion.
Absolutely. We want to clarify the frameworks, strengthen the reasoning, and really support your active reading of that text. This is not about, memorizing a dry list of rates and ratios just to pass a multiple choice test.
No, definitely not.
We want to explore why populations change and how those subtle, invisible changes silently dictate the future of human health.
So to do that, we really have to recognize that demography is the study of population size, characteristics, and dynamics. And when we say dynamics, we are talking about the three great engines of human population change.
Which are?
Fertility, mortality, and migration. But to forecast where a society is going, you have to look backward. There's this absolute mathematical necessity of time and demography.
Let's unpack that a bit because it sounds a little abstract. How does time act as a mathematical necessity?
Well, think about the proportion of very old people in a population today. Let's say we're looking at the number of 85-year-olds in a specific country right now.
Okay, got it.
That number is entirely dependent on the number of births that happened 8.5 decades ago.
Oh, right, because that's the starting pool.
Exactly. But it's not just the births. You then have to subtract the cumulative risks of death at successive ages throughout that entire 85-year intervening period.
So war, famine, disease, medical breakthroughs.
All of it. All of it carves away at that original birth cohort over time.
So you can't just look at an 85-year-old today in isolation.
No, you can't. They are the survivor of an incredibly long, complex historical filter.
That's wild.
And the same logic applies to the beginning of life, too. If we want to understand the number of births happening today, we look at the current patterns of family building. But the absolute number of babies born is fundamentally constrained by the number of women who are, quote-unquote, at risk of reproduction.
Right, the potential mothers.
Exactly. And how many women of reproductive age exist today? Well, that is a direct function of birth rates and infant mortality rates from 20 or 30 years ago.
It's just a continuous multi-generational chain reaction.
It really is.
When I was reading the text, trying to visualize this constant state of flux, I found the bathtub analogy to be incredibly helpful.
Oh, I love the bathtub analogy.
Let's lay it out. Imagine a giant bathtub. The water sitting in the tub right now is the population stock. It is the total number of people alive at this exact moment in a given area.
A snapshot of the present.
Right. Now, you have a faucet pouring water into the tub. That faucet represents the inflows. In demographic terms, that is fertility, new babies being born and immigration people moving into the area from somewhere else.
And at the bottom of the tub, you have the drain.
The drain represents the outflows. So that is mortality, people dying, and immigration people moving away.
So the water level, which is the total population, only rises if the faucet is pouring faster than the drain is emptying.
Exactly. If the drain is wider than the faucet, the tub starts to empty.
And the entire discipline of demography is essentially about measuring that water level, calculating the pressure in the faucet, measuring the width of the drain, and trying to predict whether the bathroom is going to flood or the tub is going to run completely dry.
Which brings us to the global planetary bathtub. Because over the last century, the global faucet has been wide open, and the drain has been getting narrower and narrower.
Yeah, the acceleration is it's difficult to wrap your head around. Let's look at the historical timeline. It took the entirety of human history, up until the year 1804, for the global population to reach 1 billion people.
All of human history up to 1804.
Right. Then it took 123 years, from 1804 to 1927, to add the second billion.
So a century and a quarter to duplicate what took all of human history. That's a massive acceleration.
But look at recent history. The world's population hit 7.05 billion in mid-2012. It took only 12 years, from 1999 to 2011, to go from 6 billion to 7 billion.
12 years?
We added 1 billion people in roughly a tenth of the time it took to add the second billion.
That sounds like a catastrophic flood in the making.
It does.
But the textbook makes a really crucial point here. This growth is incredibly unequal. We don't have one unified global bathtub. We have hundreds of national bathtubs, and they are all behaving in radically different ways.
The divergence in vital rates across the globe is, without a doubt, the defining public health challenge of our era.
How extreme is the divergence?
Well, projections show that between the year 2000 and 2050, 96% of all global population growth will occur in less developed or least developed countries.
96%?
Yeah. The wealthy, more developed regions will account for a mere 4% of that growth.
Let's ground that in a specific comparison to really make it real. Let's look at sub-Saharan Africa side by side with Japan.
Okay, perfect comparison.
In sub-Saharan Africa, the total fertility rate, which is a metric we will define precisely later, but just think of it as the average number of children per woman, is 5.0.
Right.
As a result, 43% of their entire population is under the age of 15. Almost half of the society consists of children.
Now contrast that with Japan. Their total fertility rate is 1.4, which is far below the replacement level of 2.1 required to maintain a stable population.
So they are shrinking.
Shrinking and aging. Because of that low birth rate, combined with incredibly long life expectancies, 23% of Japan's population is over the age of 65.
It is basically two completely alien realities. One society is defined by youth, expansion, and this constant demand for schools and pediatric care.
And the other is defined by aging, contraction, and the overwhelming need for elder care and pension funding.
And this demographic divergence completely dictates the cause of death structure for these regions, right?
Oh, entirely. In sub-Saharan Africa, 67% of all deaths are caused by communicable diseases, maternal conditions, perinatal conditions, and nutritional deficiencies.
So things you catch or things related to childbirth and poverty.
Exactly. Only 25% are non-communicable diseases like heart disease or cancer.
But if you look at Europe, it is practically a mirror image. In Europe, 88% of deaths are from non-communicable chronic diseases. Only 5% are from communicable diseases.
The age of death is equally stark. Take Sierra Leone versus Japan. In Sierra Leone, 40% of all deaths in a given year are children under the age of 5.
40%. That is heartbreaking.
It is. In Japan, children under 5 make up just 0.3% of total deaths.
Wow.
Conversely, 70% of deaths in Japan are people over the age of 75. In Sierra Leone, only 8% of deaths occur in that older age bracket.
I mean, if you were the Minister of Health in Sierra Leone, your entire budget and strategy must be focused on maternal wards, pediatric infectious disease, vaccination campaigns, early childhood nutrition.
Have to.
But if you apply that exact same strategy in Japan, you are wasting billions of dollars because the health needs are entirely centered around geriatrics, oncology, cardiology, and long-term social care. The demography is literally the destiny of the health system.
Which naturally leads to a really critical question. We throw these massive sweeping numbers, around 7 billion people, 40% mortality rates. How do we actually know this?
Right. You cannot just line up 7 billion people and count them one by one.
Definitely not.
That takes us into the methodology. How do we actually collect demographic data? The textbook traces the history of this back to the 17th century to a London merchant named John Grant.
Grant is often considered the father of modern demography. He didn't have computers. He didn't have national health services.
What did he have?
He had the London Bills of Mortality, which were basically these weekly lists published by parishes detailing who died and what killed them.
Sounds pretty rudimentary.
It was, but he took those raw lists and analyzed them to create an early life table, basically trying to find statistical patterns in the chaos of plague-era London.
But Grant faced a massive hurdle that, honestly, public health officials still struggle with today. He had the numerator. He knew how many people died, but he lacked the denominator.
Right. He didn't know the total population of London at the time. He didn't know the actual population at risk.
So to perform true demographic analysis, you really need both the stock and the flow.
Precisely. Today, our primary tool for measuring the stock, the total population at a specific moment, is the national census. And our primary tool for measuring the continuous events of births and deaths is the vital registration system.
Okay, let's examine the census first. The concept seems straightforward. Send out forms, knock on doors, count everyone.
Simple enough.
But there is a massive conceptual trap hidden in the census that can completely derail epidemiological research if you weren't careful. It's the distinction between de jure counting and de facto counting.
Oh, this is a vital distinction. De jure means counting people based on their legal or usual place of residence, regardless of where they happen to be on census night.
Okay.
De facto, on the other hand, means counting people exactly where they are physically located on the night of the census period.
To see why this matters so much for a clinician or an epidemiologist, let's build a little scenario. Imagine you live in a small, idyllic town of 10,000 people. But this town happens to be home to a massive, world-renowned regional hospital.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right, so people from 3 states over travel to your town when they are critically ill, seeking specialized care.
Now, consider what happens to the statistics if the vital registration system records deaths on a de facto basis. Meaning, if someone dies in that hospital, the death is officially assigned to your small town, simply because that is physically where the death occurred.
But the census counted your town's population on a de jure basis. It only counted the 10,000 permanent residents. It didn't count the thousands of sick patients temporarily living in the hospital or the nearby hotel.
So now you have a lethal numerator-denominator discrepancy.
Lethal to the data, anyway.
Exactly. Your numerator, the number of deaths, is wildly inflated by people from hundreds of miles away. But your denominator, the population, is restricted to the healthy locals.
So when you calculate the mortality rate,
your small town will look like the epicenter of a localized plague. It will appear to be the deadliest place in the country, simply because it happens to have an excellent hospital.
It creates a complete mathematical illusion. The data is technically accurate, right? The deaths happen there. But it's epidemiologically useless because you failed to assign the demographic events to the population actually at risk of experiencing them.
And this is exactly why modern health surveillance systems work tirelessly to link deaths back to the de jure residence of the deceased.
So that is the census, our snapshot of the stock. What about the flow, the vital registration systems?
Right. So vital registration is the compulsory continuous recording of births and deaths. It became a formalized pillar of statecraft in Europe during the 19th century. In England and Wales, civil registration started in 1837.
And a key figure in this era was William Farr, right?
Yes, William Farr. He was a medical statistician. He realized early on that a death certificate is basically useless for public health if every single doctor uses a different word to describe the exact same disease.
Which is how you get administrative chaos.
Completely. So he laid the groundwork for a standardized nomenclature, which eventually evolved into the International Classification of Diseases, or what we now call the ICD codes.
Right. Anyone who has ever worked in healthcare, even for a single day, knows about ICD codes. It is the universal language of morbidity and mortality.
It really is. It allows a researcher in Geneva to perfectly compare a heart attack in Tokyo with a heart attack in Toronto.
And this is the system is only as good as the doctor filling out the form. And the textbook highlights a very dark complication here known as garbage codes.
Yeah, garbage codes. These are deaths assigned to symptoms, signs, or ill-defined conditions that just lack any real diagnostic meaning. The most common examples are terms like old age or senility.
At first glance, that sounds kind of harmless, doesn't it? I mean, if a 95-year-old passes away peacefully in their sleep, writing old age feels intuitively correct. Why is that such a nightmare for an epidemiologist?
Because it creates a massive statistical blind spot. Old age is not a disease mechanism. If 40% of deaths in a specific region are coded as old age, you have absolutely no idea what is actually circulating in your population. You don't know if cardiovascular disease is rising, if a new respiratory pathogen is moving through care homes, or if environmental toxins are playing a role.
You just can't track the true burden of disease.
You're completely blind.
And as we touched on at the very beginning of this deep dive, there's a much more sinister side to garbage codes. Let's return to the Harold Shipman case, because it perfectly illustrates the stakes of public health data.
Yes, Harold Shipman. He was a highly respected general practitioner in the UK, and over the course of 2 decades, he systematically murdered hundreds of his elderly patients, usually by administering lethal injections of diamorphine during home visits.
And he was the sole doctor for many of these patients, so he would kill them, and then he was the one authorized to sign the death certificate.
Exactly. He consistently listed vague causes like old age or bronchial pneumonia. And because his victims were elderly, nobody questioned it. The families didn't question it, and the local authorities didn't question it.
The surveillance systems at the time just were not sophisticated enough to look for statistical anomalies hidden within garbage codes.
If he had been coding the deaths as rare poisonings, alarms would have gone off immediately. But by using old age, he blended the murders right into the expected background noise of demography.
The textbook notes a fascinating detail about the aftermath. Between 2001 and 2010 in England and Wales, the use of old age as a cause of death actually increased slightly.
Which seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. Medical science is getting better at diagnosing specific diseases, so vague codes should theoretically decrease.
Well, the increase was likely a secondary effect of tightening surveillance. After the Shipman inquiry exposed how easily this system could be manipulated, there was a massive overhaul in how death certification was scrutinized.
They realized what was at stake.
Exactly. The realization hit that accurate death coding isn't just an academic exercise for epidemiologists. It is a fundamental mechanism of state security, justice, and accountability. A robust demographic surveillance system can literally catch a serial killer.
It's just a stark reminder that public health data is deeply embedded in the legal and social fabric of a society.
Absolutely.
Now, before we leave the topic of data methodology, there is one more analytical framework we need to establish because it colors everything we will discuss regarding fertility and mortality. That is the distinction between period analysis and cohort analysis.
This is a really fundamental dichotomy in demographic thinking. A period analysis is a cross-sectional snapshot in time.
Go.
For example, calculating the mortality rates for everyone alive in the year 2010, regardless of when they were born. It captures the conditions of that specific calendar year across all age groups simultaneously.
I picture it like taking a cross-section of a tree trunk. You slice the tree down and you look at all the different rings at once. The outer rings are the young people, the inner rings are the old people, and you are evaluating their status at the exact moment the tree was cut.
That is a very apt metaphor. A cohort analysis, on the other hand, follows a specific group of people over time as they age. Usually this is a birth cohort, for instance, everyone born in the year 1950. You follow that specific group throughout their entire lives to observe their cumulative experiences.
Using the tree analogy, that would be like following a single specific ring as it grows year by year, from the sapling stage all the way to the end.
Right. And confounding can easily happen in public health if you don't recognize the difference, specifically what we call cohort effects.
Give me an example.
Let's look at lung cancer. Suppose you look at a period snapshot of lung cancer deaths in the year 2000. You observe a massive spike in mortality among 70-year-old men, but relatively low rates among 40-year-old men.
A purely period-based interpretation might conclude that lung cancer is simply a disease of old age. The older you get, the higher your risk.
But a cohort analysis reveals a totally different truth. Those 70-year-old men in the year 2000 belonged to a specific birth cohort born around 1930 who came of age during World War II and the post-war era.
Which was a time of massive culturally ingrained cigarette smoking.
Exactly. The 40-year-olds in the year 2000 belonged to a cohort born in 1960 who grew up as the dangers of smoking were becoming public knowledge, and thus they smoked much less.
Ah, so the risk wasn't just about their biological age in the year 2000. It was about the historical exposure of that specific cohort throughout their entire lives.
Mhm.
The period snapshot hides that historical context.
It does. Always ask yourself, am I looking at a snapshot of a single moment, or am I watching the documentary film of a generation?
That's a great rule of thumb. All right, having established our methodologies and our data sources, let's start measuring the actual inflows and outflows of our population bathtub. We will begin with the faucet, the measurement of fertility and reproduction rates.
Right.
First, we need a strict terminology check. In casual conversation, we use the words fertility and fecundity interchangeably. But in demography, they are completely distinct.
Very distinct. Fecundity is the physiological capability of producing a live birth. It is purely a biological potential. It simply means your reproductive system functions.
Okay.
Fertility, on the other hand, is the actual childbearing performance of a woman or a population. It is the realized outcome.
So you can be highly fecund, possessing the biological capability to have many children, but have zero fertility because you choose to use contraception or abstain from sex.
Exactly. And demography is primarily concerned with fertility, the actual babies born.
To measure that fertility, the simplest tool is the crude birth rate, or CBR.
Yes. It is calculated as the total number of live births in a year divided by the total mid-year population, usually expressed per 1,000 people.
It's simple, it's easy to calculate, but as you noted in your analysis, it is heavily flawed. It is technically a misnomer.
It is a misnomer because the crude birth rate is actually a ratio, not a true rate. A true rate in epidemiology must have the population at risk of the event in the denominator.
And the denominator for the crude birth rate is the entire population,
Right.
which includes men, children, and postmenopausal women, and none of those groups are at risk of giving birth.
Consider the distortions this creates. If a country experiences a massive influx of male migrant workers, the total population, the denominator swells.
So mathematically, the crude birth rate will mechanically drop.
Exactly, making it look like the society's fertility is collapsing.
Yeah.
In reality, the women in that country might be having exactly the same number of babies as before. Their fertility hasn't changed at all. The denominator simply diluted the truth.
To fix that mathematical illusion, demographers rely on a much more robust and vital metric, the total fertility rate, or TFR. This is the number you see in every major policy discussion. How does the TFR solve that denominator problem?
The TFR removes the distortion of age and sex structure entirely. It focuses only on women of reproductive age, typically defined as 15 to 49.
Okay.
It calculates the number of children a hypothetical cohort of women would have if they experienced the current age-specific fertility rates throughout their entire reproductive lives.
Let's break that down into steps because it's a bit of a thought experiment. You look at the current period snapshot. You calculate the birth rate specifically for the 20-year-old women today.
Yes.
Then you calculate the birth rate specifically for the 21-year-old women, the 22-year-olds, all the way up to 49. You isolate each age group.
Then you perform that thought experiment. You say, if one hypothetical woman lived through all these ages, and at each age she hit the exact average birth rate we observe today, how many babies would she have by the time she turned 50?
And the sum of all those age-specific rates gives you the total fertility rate.
It provides a single, easily understood number. A TFR of 3.5 means the average woman is having 3.5 kids. The magic threshold for the TFR is 2.1.
Why 2.1?
That is the replacement level in low mortality populations. A woman needs to have 2 children to replace herself and her partner. The extra 0.1 accounts for the fact that not all children survive to reproductive age, and there's a slight biological bias toward male births in human populations.
So if the TFR is consistently above 2.1, the population grows. If it stays below 2.1, the population will eventually shrink.
Precisely.
But the textbook also introduces reproduction rates, specifically the gross reproduction rate and the net reproduction rate. How do these differ from the TFR?
Reproduction rates take the TFR and focus specifically on the replacement of mothers by daughters. From a purely demographic standpoint, males don't dictate population growth. Females do, because they are the biological bottleneck for reproduction.
They are the actual faucet in our bathtub analogy.
Exactly. The gross reproduction rate, or GRR, calculates how many daughters a hypothetical cohort of women would have. If the TFR is 3.0, and roughly 48.8% of babies are girls, the GRR would be about 1.46.
Which tells you how many future mothers are being born per current mother.
Right. But the word gross implies it isn't accounting for something.
What's missing?
It isn't accounting for mortality. It assumes every daughter born will survive to the end of her own reproductive years. In reality, some of those daughters will tragically die in childhood. That is where the net reproduction rate, or NRR, comes in.
The NRR factors the mortality rates into the equation.
Yes. The NRR calculates the number of daughters who will not only be born, but who will actually survive to reach childbearing age themselves based on current mortality rates.
So an NRR of exactly 1.0 represents exact replacement. Every mother is replaced by exactly one daughter who survives long enough to potentially become a mother herself.
That's it.
I want to push back on the TFR for a moment. As elegant as it is, there seems to be a major flaw when applying it to modern societies. It's known as the tempo versus quantum problem. I was trying to wrap my head around this concept, and I thought of an analogy.
I'm intrigued. Let's hear it.
Okay, let's say I own a restaurant, and my target metric is the total number of dinners served per night. Historically, my culture eats dinner at 6 p.m. So every night at 6 p.m., the restaurant is packed. The total amount of food served is high.
Right.
Now imagine the culture shifts, people start working later, and the new norm is to eat dinner at 8 p.m.
A shift in timing.
Yeah.
The tempo.
Right. During the transitional years when that shift is happening, I look at my restaurant at 6 p.m. and it's completely empty. If I take a period snapshot of my business at that exact moment, I would panic and conclude my restaurant is failing, my dinner rate has plummeted.
But in reality, the same number of people are going to show up. They're just delaying their arrival until 8 p.m.
Exactly. My quantum hasn't changed, only the tempo has.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it perfectly captures the vulnerability of the period TFR. The TFR assumes that the timing of births across a woman's life is static. But in recent decades, particularly in developed nations, women have massively delayed childbearing to pursue higher education and establish careers.
They didn't necessarily decide they want 0 children. They just decided they want their 2 children in their 30s instead of their 20s.
Right. And when a whole generation decides to delay childbearing, the birth rates for women in their 20s plummet. And because they haven't reached their 30s yet, the birth rates for older women haven't increased to compensate.
So if you calculate the period TFR during that transitional decade, it artificially crashes.
Yes. It looks like a massive collapse in the quantum, the total desire for children, when a significant portion of the decline is merely a tempo effect.
We saw this play out in the United States recently. The U.S. TFR dropped from over 2.1 in 2007 to below 1.9 a few years later, and it generated endless headlines about a baby bust.
Part of that was a true decline in quantum people genuinely wanting fewer kids due to economic stress. But a large portion was simply women hitting the pause button.
Because of this tempo distortion, many demographic institutions prefer to look at cohort fertility for a more accurate picture, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
Instead of a period snapshot, they look at a cohort of women who have just turned 50 and have completed their reproductive years. They simply count. How many children did this cohort actually have over their lifetime? It removes the timing noise entirely.
So we have thoroughly analyzed the faucet. Now we must turn our attention to the drain, the ultimate shaper of population boundaries. The measurement of mortality and life tables.
Just as we started with the crude birth rate, we start with the crude death rate, the CDR.
Which is simply the total number of deaths in a year divided by the mid-year population, expressed per 1,000 people.
And it suffers from the exact same structural flaw as the crude birth rate. It is heavily distorted by the age structure of the population.
The textbook poses a classic demographic trick question to prove this point. Let's walk through it. Okay.
Which region has a higher crude death rate? The more developed regions of the world, like Europe and North America, or the less developed regions, like Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia?
Well, intuition strongly points to the less developed regions. We associate them with poorer health infrastructure, higher rates of infectious disease, and lower standards of living. You naturally assume people die at a higher rate there.
But the data reveals the exact opposite. In the 2005 to 2010 tracking period, the crude death rate in more developed regions was 10.0 per 1,000 people. In less developed regions, it was 8.0 per 1,000.
The wealthy, technologically advanced nations have a higher crude rate of death.
It's a paradox.
The paradox is entirely explained by the denominator's age structure. More developed regions have massive populations of people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Even with world-class healthcare, advanced surgical interventions, and preventative medicine, an 80-year-old simply has a higher biological probability of dying in a given year than a 20-year-old. Meanwhile, less developed regions have gigantic populations of children, teenagers, and young adults. Even though their healthcare systems might be fragile, a 20-year-old is highly unlikely to die.
So mathematically, because Europe has so many old people, their overall crude death rate is higher.
This proves unequivocally that you cannot use crude death rates to compare the health status or healthcare efficacy of two different nations. You are comparing apples and oranges.
To make a valid comparison, you must use age-specific mortality rates, comparing the 20-year-olds in Europe directly to the 20-year-olds in Africa. Or you use standardization techniques like the SMR.
The standardized mortality ratio. How does the SMR strip away that demographic noise to reveal true health disparities?
The SMR uses a technique called indirect standardization. Let's go back to our hypothetical small town with the hospital, assuming we've fixed the du jour problem.
Okay, town is fixed.
You want to know if the residents of this town are unhealthier than the national average? You can't just look at their total deaths, because maybe the town is a popular retirement community full of elderly people.
So you need a baseline expectation.
Yes. You take a standard set of age-specific death rates, usually the rates for the entire country. You look at the age structure of your specific town, and you apply those national rates. You say, based strictly on the ages of the people living here, if this town had perfectly average national health, how many people will we expect to die this year?
And that gives you your expected deaths. Then you count the observed deaths, the people who actually died.
And the SMR is simply the observed deaths divided by the expected deaths, often multiplied by 100. If the SMR is 124, it means the observed deaths were 24% higher than expected, after completely accounting for the town's age structure.
Now you have a clear signal. You know there is a genuine environmental or healthcare problem in that town, independent of age.
It isolates the signal from the noise.
Now let's move to what I think is the most fascinating analytical tool in the entire chapter. It is the demographer's crystal ball, the life table.
Life tables are brilliant pieces of statistical architecture. They were originally designed by actuaries in the 18th and 19th centuries who needed to figure out how much to charge for life insurance.
Naturally, it all comes back to money.
To price a policy, they needed a mathematical model of human survival.
Let's put ourselves in the shoes of one of those 19th century actuaries. We need to build a life table. Where do we even start? It feels like learning a secret mathematical language.
The foundation of the life table is a set of probabilities, specifically the probability of dying between specific ages, denoted in demographic notation as kilo. Once you observe the population and calculate the values for every age group, you can build the table.
You start the table with a hypothetical cohort. Imagine 100,000 babies all born at the exact same moment. That starting number, the 100,000, is called the red X. It is denoted as lauder dollars.
The letter dollar stands for survivors. You take your 100,000 babies and you apply the infant mortality probability, the DILR. A certain number die in their first year. You subtract them. The survivors who reach their first birthday become 1 under 1.
Then you apply the probability of dying between age 1 and age 5. You subtract those deaths and the survivors become $50.
You just keep marching this hypothetical cohort forward through time, applying the mortality risks of each age group, and watching the survivor column dwindle would be the number of those original 100,000 babies who managed to stay alive to celebrate their 75th birthday.
Through this step-by-step attrition, the table generates a wealth of data. But the ultimate output, the metric that politicians, economists, and public health officials care about most, is X expectancy.
Life expectancy, specifically $T life expectancy at birth. This is the number you see in the headlines every year. Life expectancy drops to 78.
But there is a massive, incredibly common misconception about this number that the textbook explicitly addresses. Life expectancy at birth does not mean the usual or most common age of death.
It is a critical distinction that fundamentally alters how you view historical and global health data.
If I hear that a country in a state of conflict has a life expectancy of 50, my brain immediately paints a sci-fi picture. I imagine a society like the movie Logan's Run, where everyone reaches their 50th birthday and then suddenly drops dead. It implies the maximum biological lifespan has been capped at 50.
But the math of the life table doesn't work that way at all.
Yeah.
Life expectancy, $T is a mean. It is a mathematical average of the age of death for the entire cohort.
Right.
In populations with high infant and child mortality, the distribution of death is bimodal. It has two massive peaks.
Walk us through that bimodal shit.
Imagine a graph. The first peak is right at the beginning at age 0. In historically harsh environments, a massive percentage of the cohort dies in infancy from infectious diseases, diarrheal diseases, or malnutrition.
But if a child manages to survive that gauntlet and reaches age 5 or 10, their immune system strengthens.
Yes, they are largely safe until old age. The second peak of deaths occurs at age 60, 70, or 80.
So you have a huge cluster of people dying at age 0 and a huge cluster of people dying at age 70. If you take the mathematical average of 0 and 70, you get 35 or 40. The high mortality at age 0 drags the overall average down drastically.
Exactly. The average is 40, but almost nobody actually dies at age 40. The mean does not represent the modal or most common experience.
This is why looking at further life expectancy at a specific age is so illuminating. The life table doesn't just calculate $2, it calculates $6 for every age.
Right.
If you make it to age 65, the table calculates your further life expectancy only from that point forward. The infant deaths are no longer dragging your personal average down because you already survived infancy.
The textbook provides a stunning historical example of this. In the United States in the year 1900, female life expectancy at birth was roughly 49 years. Again, the temptation is to believe women in 1900 rapidly aged and died at 49.
But the life table reveals the truth.
Yes. If a woman in 1900 navigated the dangers of childhood diseases and survived the very real risks of maternal mortality during her reproductive years and made it to age 65, her further life expectancy was 12 more years. She was statistically expected to live to age 77.
It completely reframes our understanding of human history. The fundamental biological lifespan of a human being hasn't suddenly doubled in the last century. We haven't magically stretched the aging process.
No, what public health and modern medicine have done is conquer infant and child mortality. We removed the first peak of the bimodal distribution, which allows the vast majority of the population to actually reach the biological finish line.
We have discussed births, the inflows, we have discussed deaths, the outflows. Now we must turn to the final variable in the demographic equation, the one that moves people horizontally across the map, the measurement of migration.
Migration feels entirely different from fertility and mortality. A birth is a concrete biological fact. A death is a concrete biological fact. But migration is a conceptual construct.
It is purely a spatial phenomenon, heavily reliant on administrative and legal boundaries. Yet it is the predominant influence on spatial distribution today.
It is driving the incredible phenomenon of global urbanization. By 2010, 52% of the global population lived in urban areas, which is a fundamental reshaping of human habitation.
But measuring it seems like an epidemiological nightmare. Let's say you want to compare internal migration rates between two countries. In country A, the nation is divided into thousands of tiny administrative districts, like counties.
Right.
If you move 5 miles down the road, you cross a county line, and you are officially recorded in the national database as an internal migrant.
But consider country B, which is divided into 3 massive state-sized provinces. You could move 500 miles away, change jobs, change climates, and completely alter your social network.
But if you didn't cross a provincial boundary,
The government doesn't classify you as migrant.
international comparison is virtually impossible because the size of the net we use to catch the migrants changes depending on the country's arbitrary lines. And that's just legal internal migration. What about international migration, especially undocumented migration?
It's notoriously difficult. You can't just send out a census form and ask people to admit they crossed a border without a visa. People simply won't answer, or they will hide.
When direct measurement fails, demographers become mathematical detectives. They utilize the balancing equation backwards. Let's lay out the basic balancing equation first. It is the fundamental law of population mathematics.
The equation states, the population at time 2 equals the population at time 1, plus births minus deaths plus net migration.
It's just accounting. Your current bank balance is your starting balance, plus deposits minus withdrawals. So how do we use this backwards to catch undocumented migration?
Let's say you have 2 highly accurate national censuses taken 10 years apart. You know the exact population at time 1, and you know the exact population at time 2.
Oh.
Furthermore, you have an excellent vital registration system, so you know exactly how many legal births and deaths occurred during that 10-year gap.
So you take your starting population, you add all the registered births, you subtract all the registered deaths. This calculates your expected population.
Right. This is exactly how many people should be in the country if the borders were entirely sealed and no one ever moved in or out.
Then you look at the actual count from the second census. If your expected population is 50 million, But the new census counts 51 million people.
That extra million people didn't spontaneously generate. They had to come from somewhere.
Exactly. The residual difference, the missing or extra people, must be net migration.
Now, a crucial caveat is that the residual also absorbs all data errors. If your second census severely undercounted marginalized communities, it will look like there was mass emigration out of the country, when in reality the people are still there, just uncounted.
But mathematically, isolating that residual is our most robust method for estimating the invisible flows of migration.
We have dismantled the three components: fertility, mortality, and migration. Now we must put them back together to see how populations behave dynamically over time. This leads us into population dynamics and projections.
These variables do not operate in isolated silos. They interact in surprising, complex feedback loops.
The interaction between mortality and fertility is particularly fascinating. Changes in one dial directly impact the other.
The textbook offers a brilliant example of this, something totally counterintuitive. It notes that falling male mortality can actually cause fertility to increase. My initial reaction was confusion. How on earth does men living longer cause women to have more babies? The men aren't the ones giving birth.
It requires looking at the sociological structure of marriage in traditional societies. In many historical populations, there's a significant age gap between spouses. The husband might be 10, 15, or even 20 years older than the wife.
All right, an age gap marriage.
And in these traditional societies, childbearing occurs almost exclusively within the bounds of marriage. Furthermore, the remarriage of widows might be culturally stigmatized, economically unfeasible, or outright forbidden.
Now introduce high mortality rates.
If adult male mortality is high, many of these much older husbands will die while their younger wives are still in their prime reproductive years, perhaps in their late 20s or early 30s.
The woman's reproductive window is effectively slammed shut early. She is widowed, she cannot remarry, and therefore she ceases to have children.
Right. She might have had 6 children if the marriage lasted until she was 45, but she only has 3 before she is widowed. Her biological fecundity is cut off from realizing its full demographic fertility.
But if public health improves, if we introduce better sanitation, treat infectious diseases, and adult male mortality falls, those older husbands survive much longer.
The marriage remains intact through the woman's entire reproductive window. She continues to have children into her late 30s and 40s. Her fertility realizes its full potential. Thus, a drop in male deaths directly causes a rise in births.
That is brilliant systems thinking. It highlights why public health interventions often have unintended demographic consequences. You introduce a medicine to keep men alive, and suddenly you need more pediatric clinics a decade later.
Speaking of looking a decade later, the text makes a strict, pedantic distinction between demographic projections and forecasts.
Demographers are extremely rigid about this terminology, and for good reason. A projection is basically an if-then statement. It is a pure mathematical exercise.
Right. It takes a starting population and applies a set of assumed rates, say, assuming fertility stays exactly at 2.5 and mortality drops by 1% a year, and calculates what the population would look like in 50 years if those arbitrary assumptions hold true.
It makes no claim about reality. It just runs the math. But a forecast.
A forecast is an active prediction of what will happen in reality. It incorporates expert judgment, expected policy changes, economic trends, and behavioral shifts.
When you read a newspaper headline claiming global population to hit 9 billion by 2050, that is almost always a projection being inappropriately treated as a forecast.
And the text notes that when experts do try to forecast, they consistently fail in 2 specific areas. They systematically underestimate both migration and the survival of the elderly.
We constantly fail to predict how much people will move because migration is deeply tied to volatile, unpredictable political and economic shocks, wars, famines, sudden border openings.
And we've historically underestimated how long older people can survive. Every time demographers establish what they believe to be the ultimate biological ceiling for life expectancy, medical science breaks through it.
This persistent underestimation has led to far more elderly people than our pension systems and healthcare infrastructure were projected to handle. Which brings us to the profound architectural shifts that happen when these dynamics compound over decades. Let's look at population growth and age structure.
I want to spend some time on the concept of population momentum, because it is crucial for global policy.
Imagine a massive, incredibly heavy freight train roaring down the tracks at 80 miles an hour.
A physical manifestation of kinetic energy.
Exactly. This speeding train represents a high-fertility country. The population is growing rapidly. The momentum is massive. Now, let's say the government wakes up, realizes the growth is unsustainable, and implements a highly effective, culturally accepted family planning program. Fertility drops immediately from 5.0 down to the replacement level of 2.1. The engineer slams on the brakes. What happens to the train?
The train does not stop on a dime. The laws of physics dictate that it will keep sliding forward, screaming along the tracks for miles, simply because of its immense momentum.
And the laws of demography dictate the exact same thing for human populations. Even if a high fertility country drops to replacement level fertility today, its absolute population size will continue to grow for decades.
Why? Because the massive cohorts of children born during the high fertility era are already on the train. They're already alive. Over the next 20 years, that massive generation of youth will grow up and enter their own reproductive years.
Even if those millions of young couples only have 2 children, each strict replacement level, the sheer absolute number of potential parents guarantees that the total number of births will far exceed the total number of deaths occurring in the much smaller, older generations.
The population base expands simply because the faucet is exceptionally wide, even if the flow rate through each individual nozzle has been reduced.
You can hit the brakes on the rate, but the absolute size keeps rolling. Sub-Saharan Africa's population is projected to more than double by 2050. Part of that is ongoing high fertility, but a massive portion of that growth is already locked in by this built-in momentum.
This mathematical inevitability of age structure was formally proven over a century ago by Alfred Lotka in 1907. He introduced stable population theory.
It is a beautiful, elegant piece of mathematics. Lotka proved that if a population is close to migration, and it is subject to constant, unchanging age-specific birth and death rates for a sufficiently long period, it eventually locks into a fixed, unchanging age structure.
Meaning the proportion of the society that is under 15 or over 65 stays exactly the same year after year, even if the total size of the population is growing to infinity or shrinking to zero.
The population basically forgets whatever weird age structure it started with and settled into a rigid architectural shape dictated entirely by those constant vital rates.
And we visualize these architectural shapes using population pyramids.
I find population pyramids to be the most compelling graphs in all of science. You can glance at a pyramid and instantly read the entire traumatic or triumphant history of a nation. Let's compare 2 extremes. Look at the pyramid of a rapidly growing country like Bangladesh from a few decades ago.
It looks like a true geometric pyramid. It has a massive, wide base that tapers sharply up to a narrow point at the top. That wide base represents massive cohorts of children born due to high fertility. The sharp taper indicates high mortality rates eating away at those cohorts as they age.
But then you look at a modern developed nation like the United Kingdom, it doesn't look like a pyramid at all. It looks like a rectangle or even a column that is slightly top-heavy.
The base is narrow because birth rates have plummeted, and the sides go straight up, barely tapering, because survival rates are so high, resulting in a thick top layer of people in their 80s and 90s.
The transition between those 2 shapes, the metamorphosis from the wide pyramid to the stable rectangle, creates a unique, temporary, historical window known as the demographic dividend.
The demographic dividend is arguably the most powerful economic force of the late 20th century. How does the shape of the pyramid translate into an economic boom?
It happens during the transitional phase. When a country's fertility first starts to drop significantly, the massive, wide base of the pyramid shrinks. Suddenly, the society has far fewer dependent children to feed, clothe, educate, and vaccinate. The economic burden of childhood plummets.
But the massive cohorts of children born just before the fertility drop occurred are now growing up. They are entering their 20s and 30s. They are entering their prime working years.
So you have a massive bulging workforce in the middle of the pyramid supporting a shrinking base of children. And because historical life expectancies were lower, a still relatively small top layer of elderly dependents.
It is the ultimate economic sweet spot. You have an ocean of workers and hardly any dependents. Families aren't spending all their income feeding 6 kids. They have 2 kids, and they put the surplus income into savings.
Banks use those massive national savings pools to issue loans, build shipyards, fund tech sectors, and industrialize the nation. The textbook points to the East Asian tigers, countries like South Korea and Taiwan, as the prime examples of nations that successfully harness this demographic dividend to achieve miraculous economic growth in a single generation.
But the critical word is window. The dividend is temporary. It eventually closes because that massive workforce inevitably ages. 30 years later, they retire. They become a massive elderly dependent class, turning the rectangle top-heavy, and the economic burden returns in the form of pensions and healthcare.
The journey from that wide base pyramid to a rectangular one is the overarching story of global modernization. It leads us directly into the grand unifying theory of demography, the demographic transition model.
The classical theory, proposed by Frank Notestein in 1945, attempts to map this journey. It describes the historical shift from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates as a society modernizes.
Notestein's model is laid out in stages. You start in stage 1, a traditional pre-industrial society. Death rates are brutally high due to infectious disease, famine, and poor sanitation. To compensate for massive infant mortality and ensure survival, cultural norms dictate that birth rates must also be incredibly high. The population size is stable, but the turnover is rapid and tragic.
Then comes stage 2. Economic advance begins, agricultural yields improve, basic sanitation is introduced, clean water systems are built. The death rate plummets dramatically. People stop dying of preventable diseases.
But the birth rate stays high. Cultural norms favoring large families take generations to change. You don't abandon the concept of a large family just because a sewer was built last year.
So for a few decades, you have low deaths and high births. The faucet is open, the drain is plugged, the population explodes. This is the stage of massive natural increase.
Finally, we reach stage 3 and stage 4. Modernization, urbanization, and mass education take hold. The society shifts from agricultural to industrial. Living in a city, children are no longer free farm labor. They require expensive housing and education. The birth rate finally falls to match the low death rate. The population stabilizes again, but at a much higher total number and with an older rectangular age structure.
That is the neat, elegant, classical view. But the textbook points out that history is rarely that clean. Later researchers, notably Ansley Cole and John Caldwell, investigated the actual historical data and found massive pushbacks against Notestein's theory.
Coley looked at the historical fertility decline in Europe and realized it didn't perfectly align with economic thresholds. It wasn't just about reaching a certain level of wealth.
Sometimes fertility decline moved along cultural, religious, or linguistic lines, spreading like an idea rather than an economic necessity. Even more disruptive to the classical theory, he found instances in England where fertility fell before infant mortality dropped.
Caldwell provided a fascinating sociological framework to explain these shifts, focusing on westernization and the flow of wealth within families, the reversal of intergenerational wealth flows. This concept changed how I view family structures.
Caldwell argued that in traditional agrarian societies, the net flow of wealth moves upward, from children to parents. Children are put to work early. They are agricultural labor. They provide Social Security for the elderly. They are a net economic asset. It makes rational economic sense to have as many as possible.
But as societies westernize, particularly through the introduction of compulsory mass education, that dynamic violently reverses. The net flow of wealth moves downward, from parents to children.
Suddenly, children are legally required to be in school instead of the fields. They require uniforms, books, expensive urban housing, and decades of financial support. They transform from an economic asset into an immense economic cost. Caldwell argued that once parents consciously realize this reversal has happened, fertility plummets.
Coley summarized the required psychological shift into 3 specific prerequisites for a society to experience a sustained fertility decline. First, fertility must be within the calculus of conscious choice. People have to break free of fatalism and believe they actually can and should control their family size.
Second, there must be a perceived advantage to having fewer kids, like Caldwell's wealth flow reversal. And third, you need effective techniques to prevent pregnancy.
If those 3 conditions are met, fertility drops. And what modern demographers are observing is that the drop doesn't magically stop at the replacement level of 2.1. It keeps dropping, driving societies into a phenomenon known as lowest low fertility.
Sometimes called the second demographic transition. The textbook highlights countries in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and East Asia where total fertility rates have crashed below 1.3. South Korea recently made headlines for dipping well below 1.0.
This isn't a minor demographic fluctuation. It is a structural transformation of human society. What is driving fertility into the floor?
A primary driver of lowest low fertility is a precipitous, unprecedented fall in marriage rates. The textbook uses Japan as a prime example of this shift. In the mid-20th century, marriage in Japan was near universal. largely facilitated by strong cultural expectations and arranged marriages.
But the cultural landscape has fundamentally altered.
Changing gender roles are central to this. Women have gained massive access to higher education and the labor market. However, in many low fertility countries, the corporate culture and labor markets remain highly inflexible, and domestic duties are not shared equally.
Women face a massive opportunity cost. If having a child means sacrificing a hard-won career because the system doesn't support working mothers, many choose to delay or forgo marriage entirely.
It is projected that a fifth of the Japanese population will remain unmarried at age 45. When marriage rates collapse in societies where childbearing is still strongly linked to marriage, fertility rates collapse with them.
We have discussed these broad, sweeping social desires, the economic cost of children, the desire for career advancement, the delay of marriage. But how exactly do these abstract sociological concepts translate into actual biological reality? People still possess the same biological drives and fecundity.
This brings us to the bridge between sociology and biology, the proximate determinants of fertility. A demographer named John Bongartz developed an incredibly elegant model to explain this translation.
He recognized that abstract social factors like women wanting higher education cannot magically prevent pregnancy. They must operate through specific biological or behavioral mechanisms. He called these the proximate determinants.
He identified four primary variables that account for almost all the variation in actual fertility levels between different human populations. Let's walk through them.
The first is the proportion of women married, or more accurately, the proportion of women regularly exposed to the risk of pregnancy. If marriage is delayed, exposure is delayed.
The second is contraceptive use, the direct intentional prevention of conception using devices or hormones. The third is induced abortion, the intentional termination of a pregnancy.
And the fourth is the one that I found utterly fascinating from a global public health perspective: postpartum non-susceptibility.
Which is driven almost entirely by breastfeeding practices.
In the developed world, we immediately equate fertility control with modern contraception pills, IUDs, condoms. But in non-contracepting populations historically, and in many developing regions today, breastfeeding is the primary biological regulator of human population growth. How does it work?
It is a profound evolutionary mechanism known as lactational amenorrhea. When a mother breastfeeds her infant frequently, intensely, and exclusively, the physical stimulation triggers a hormonal cascade that suppresses ovulation.
The body essentially recognizes that it is already expending massive energetic resources feeding one infant, and it pauses the reproductive system to prevent a competing pregnancy.
In societies with protracted on-demand breastfeeding, this natural suppression can delay the return of fertility for 18 months or more after a birth. It acts as a natural biological spacing mechanism between children.
And the public health implications of this spacing are monumental. The textbook notes that delaying closely spaced births could reduce under 5 mortality by as much as 30% in some countries.
30%. That is a staggering intervention. Connect the biological mechanism of breastfeeding to that massive reduction in child mortality. Why does spacing matter so much?
Closely spaced pregnancies are biologically devastating. They deplete the mother's nutritional reserves, leading to maternal anemia and higher risks of maternal mortality. For the infants, a rapid subsequent pregnancy usually forces the early weaning of the first child, exposing them to contaminated water and malnutrition before their immune system is ready.
Furthermore, two infants born very close together are suddenly competing for the mother's limited time, calories, and care. By promoting extended, exclusive breastfeeding, a public health program achieves a miraculous trifecta.
You provide the infant with optimal nutrition and passive immunity through antibodies. You protect the mother from the physical depletion of back-to-back pregnancies. And you naturally space out the births, giving both the current child and the future child a drastically higher probability of survival. It is an incredibly powerful, multifaceted intervention that requires no modern medical technology.
Just as fertility undergoes a massive transition driven by changing social desires and these proximate determinants, mortality undergoes its own profound historical metamorphosis. Let's examine the shift in what actually kills us, the epidemiological transition.
The concept was coined by Abdel Amran in 1971. The epidemiological transition describes the grand historical shift in the primary causes of human mortality. We move from an era dominated by infectious and parasitic diseases, what Amran called the age of pestilence and famine, to an era dominated by chronic and degenerative diseases, the age of degenerative and man-made diseases.
Humanity stopped dying from acute pathogens we catch from the environment and started dying from the chronic decay of our own aging bodies.
We stopped dying of cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox, and we started dying of ischemic heart disease, stroke, and cancer. And the text points out a fascinating demographic quirk of this transition. Historically, it favored women significantly more than men.
It created the gender gap in life expectancy that we view as normal today. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as public health improved, the declines in infectious diseases disproportionately benefited female survival.
Obviously, maternal mortality plummeted with better obstetrics and hygiene, but what else drove the gap?
Respiratory tuberculosis was a massive killer that heavily afflicted young women in their prime. As tuberculosis rates collapsed, female life expectancy soared. Meanwhile, men did not experience the same rapid gains. As societies industrialized, men were heavily overrepresented in dangerous occupational hazards within heavy industry, mining, and construction.
Furthermore, men adopted lethal lifestyle behaviors, specifically mass cigarette smoking, decades earlier and at much higher rates than women. So women pulled ahead, creating the demographic reality where elderly populations are overwhelmingly female.
Now, how did this massive epidemiological transition actually happen? Historically, in Europe and North America, the transition was intimately tied to rising economic wealth. Better housing, robust sanitation infrastructure, stable nutrition, these require immense societal wealth to build.
But the textbook introduces a concept that completely blew my mind, proving that health and wealth can be decoupled. It is the concept of exogenous mortality decline.
This is the moment in human history where the narrative shifts from slow economic development to the rapid deployment of medical technology. The textbook uses a graph called the Preston curve to illustrate this. The curve plots a country's average wealth against its life expectancy.
Let's look at the specific data points it provides because they are staggering. In the year 1901, the United States had a life expectancy of 49 years, and its average income, adjusted for modern purchasing power, was roughly $7,300.
$7,300 bought you 49 years of life in 1901 America.
Now, fast forward over a century. In the year 2009, China had an average income of about $7,400.
Roughly the exact same level of wealth as the U.S. a century earlier.
But China's life expectancy in 2009 wasn't 49 years, it was 73 years. How does a country possessing 1901 level wealth manage to achieve 2009 level health?
That is the definition of exogenous mortality decline. The entire Preston curve, the relationship between wealth and health, shifted dramatically upward over the 20th century. Why? Because the knowledge and technology of survival became exportable. By 2009, humanity had invented cheap, scalable interventions: childhood vaccines, antibiotics, oral rehydration therapy for diarrhea, and insecticides for mosquito control.
China didn't have to wait 100 years to slowly invent the sewer system and discover penicillin from scratch. They didn't have to become as wealthy as the modern United States to achieve a long lifespan. They could simply import and deploy the technologies that had already been invented. Medical technology completely decoupled mortality from total economic wealth.
It is the ultimate triumph of global public health. However, as we move into the final section, recent demographic trends in public health, we have to face the reality that these miraculous transitions have landed us in a present day facing a completely new, incredibly daunting set of storms.
We solve the old problems, we close the drain of infectious disease, and our reward is entirely new problems.
The textbook highlights a critical vulnerability in the developing world today. Because of exogenous mortality decline, many countries in Asia and Latin America are experiencing massive increases in life expectancy before they have achieved high levels of wealth. They are, quite literally, growing old before they grow rich.
Europe had a century of steady economic growth to slowly adapt its social structures to an aging population. They built massive tax bases to fund pensions.
But developing nations are seeing their populations age into rectangular pyramids in a matter of decades, without the underlying economic engine to support enormous pension liabilities or complex chronic healthcare systems.
We are also seeing a rapid evolution in changing family structures. The rise of single-parent households, particularly lone mother households, breaks the traditional models of care and creates entirely new vulnerabilities for childhood poverty and maternal stress. The health system has to step in where the extended family used to exist.
And we absolutely cannot assume the epidemiological transition is a guaranteed one-way street to perfect health. The textbook stresses the reality of catastrophic reversals. The HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1990s and 2000s caused massive mortality reversals in sub-Saharan Africa, wiping out decades of hard-won life expectancy gains and fundamentally warping population pyramids by hollowing out the prime working-age adults.
Furthermore, the chronic diseases of the wealthy world are being actively exported. Tobacco use, which is the ultimate man-made disease, is now casting a looming shadow over middle and low-income countries. As smoking rates decline in the West, multinational tobacco companies aggressively shift their markets to younger, growing populations in the developing world.
This is exactly why demography acts as the early warning radar system for global public health. It isn't just about counting people for the sake of a spreadsheet. It is tracking the incoming storms. If you observe a massive youth bulge in a developing country's population pyramid and you simultaneously track a high uptake in adolescent tobacco use, you don't need a crystal ball. You know exactly what their oncology wards and cardiovascular ICUs are going to look like 30 years from now. You can see the crisis approaching from decades away.
It provides the blueprint. It exposes the load-bearing walls of the society.
It provides the denominator. Without it, you are flying blind.
Which brings us to a final, provocative thought. As we look at the trajectory of the data life expectancy, continuously pushing higher into the 80s and 90s, while fertility drops well below replacement levels across the globe, we are moving into entirely uncharted territory for our species. For the entirety of human history, up until this very moment, the young have vastly outnumbered the old. Our biology, our economic models of growth, our fundamental psychology and optimism as a species were built on the foundation of a wide-based demographic pyramid, a world defined by youth, expansion, and constant renewal.
We are the first generations to experience the inversion of that pyramid.
What happens to the fundamental psychology, the innovation, the risk tolerance of a society when its population pyramid completely inverts? Does an aging population become inherently more risk-averse? Does it change not just the logistics of healthcare, but the trajectory of human progress itself? When the load-bearing walls of our demographic architecture flip upside down, what kind of society are we actually building?
That is the defining question of the 21st century. Now let's lock in some of the core concepts from today's deep dive. I'll run through 6 rapid-fire, single best answer recall prompts based on the material. Think of the answer before I reveal it. Prompt 1. Which demographic measure indicates the number of children a hypothetical cohort of women would have if they experienced current age-specific fertility rates throughout their reproductive lives? Answer: the total fertility rate, or TFR review section. The measurement of fertility. Prompt 2. What causes a discrepancy between the numerator and denominator, potentially creating artificially high mortality rates in a specific geographic area, like a town with a regional hospital? Answer: counting deaths de facto, where they physically occur, rather than de jure, the deceased's usual place of residence. Review section. Demographic data, censuses, and vital registration. Prompt 3. In a life table, does E0, life expectancy at birth, represent the most common age of death in a population? Answer: no. In populations with high infant mortality, deaths are concentrated in infancy and older age, meaning E0 is an average, not the modal age of death. Review section. The measurement of mortality in life tables. Prompt 4. What concept explains why a population will continue to grow for decades, even if fertility rates immediately fall to replacement level? Answer: population momentum, driven by a high proportion of young people already in the population entering reproductive age. Review section. Population growth and age structure. Prompt 5. According to the Bongert's model, what is the primary biological determinant of postpartum non-susceptibility to conception in non-contracepting populations? Answer: breastfeeding practices, which induce lactational amenorrhea. Review section. The proximate determinants of fertility. Prompt 6. Omron's epidemiological transition describes the historical shift in mortality from which primary causes to which newly dominant causes. Answer: from infectious and parasitic diseases to chronic and degenerative diseases. Review section. The epidemiological transition.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible math that shapes our world.
Here are the details of this episode.
Demography. Byline: counting populations, tracing transitions, how births, deaths, and migration shape the health of nations.